Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. Well, what a fascinating story we're on. We're on part 4 of our story tonight, and we have now got somebody who has been bludgeoned to death, and we're going to find out exactly why. What did happen to Michael Drewbury? So before we continue with our story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 4 of our story tonight. Clara's account, 5 years later. You're really going to love my grandmother, Dustin told me. Wait until you meet her. I think she's going to love you. You've been my best kept secret, Clara, for the last 6 months. I only told my grandmother about you yesterday, so it came as quite a surprise to her. But I needed to be absolutely sure where our relationship was going before I introduced you to her, or told her about you. You see, my grandmother is very protective over me. I've only ever lived with her all my life, and I've never brought a girl back home to the cabin before. You're the very first. I looked at Dustin aghast. You mean that all the while we've been dating, that you've never mentioned me to your grandmother before? She doesn't know about me. You're not ashamed of me, are you, Dustin? Dustin flushed. He grew red with embarrassment. He reached out to squeeze my hand reassuringly. Ashamed of you, Clara? Are you kidding? You're the best thing that has ever happened to me. Of course I'm not ashamed of you. Where would you get such a preposterous idea from? I like you a lot. Well, that's actually an understatement. I really, really like you. Please don't be mad with me. I just find it rather difficult to talk to my grandmother about personal stuff. She's a very reserved woman, you know. I did happen to tell her I'd accepted a job with your father to help him look after his horses. She was very pleased about it, but I failed to mention that your father had a beautiful daughter, and that was the real reason that I was working for him. I raised my brow. You do surprise me, Dustin. So you're telling me your grandmother doesn't know a thing about us? I'm surprised she hasn't guessed. What about some of the late nights we've enjoyed together? Surely she must smell a rat. My grandmother could sleep through a hurricane, and I'm not kidding about that either. So when I've slipped out late at night to meet you, she's long since retired to bed. She often listens to audiobooks with her headphones on, so I suspect she doesn't hear a thing. So what did she do when you told her about us? What did she say? Well, it was hard to gauge her reaction, really, Dustin admitted. At first she seemed to go quite pale. Then she chuckled and said, So you've been seeing someone, have you, Dustin? You really are a dark horse, aren't you? You didn't think to tell your grandmother about this? Who is she, Dustin? I told her she's the most beautiful girl I've ever met, Granny. I told her I liked you a lot and that I was serious about you. And what did she say about that? Dustin shrugged awkwardly. Well, she wasn't that impressed, I have to admit. She said I was young and impressionable, and that we were both still young and naive. But even so, she said she's looking forward to meeting you. Lovely! Is that what she said? It doesn't exactly inspire me with any confidence, Dustin. Don't be like that, Clara. That's my grandmother for you. You can't blame her for being a perennial cynic. After all, she's never been married. I think she's rather scathing about love. But surely she's had boyfriends in the past. After all, she gave birth to your mother Kendall, didn't she? So she must have been intimate with a man before. My grandmother has always been an attractive woman. Men have always been interested in her. But she hasn't responded in kind, so to speak. And as for boyfriends, she hasn't had any. The only time she came close to dating anyone was when she met a man called Michael Drewbury. He lived in a neighbouring farm from us. He showed a great deal of interest in her. She wasn't exactly enamoured with him in the beginning, but I think he worked his magic on her, because she finally agreed to go on a date with him on his ATV in the Woodgrove. He went and took a leak. She heard a strange scream coming from him, and then he vanished. Later the police found his body. His eyes had been gouged out. It looked like his head had been whacked with a hammer. I guess after that my grandmother was sworn off dating men for good. Having a date like that is not going to make you keen on going out with anybody else, is it? But that's terrible, Dustin. You never told me about this. Well, it's not something I like to talk about. It's desperately sad, you see. Michael Drewbury was a very, very nice man. My grandmother was lucky to go out with him. I think they would have been a great couple. So what happened to him doesn't bear talking about. What did the police do about it? Nothing, really. The case is still open, but there are no new leads in the investigation as to what had actually happened to Michael Drewbury. I do know his brother was a suspect for quite some time. I was rather apprehensive about meeting Dustin's grandmother, Nora. She clearly had a dim view of relationships, as she herself had never been married, even though Dustin informed me that she had not been short of male admirers. She had always been and still remained a good-looking woman, who had made her fortune from a young age, and as a result had supported Dustin on the income generated from her investments. I wondered why such a woman had never married before. But from what Dustin had told me about his grandmother, I had a nasty inkling in my gut that my boyfriend's grandmother would not like me making an abrupt, unwelcome appearance into their lives. If that woman had diligently homeschooled Dustin from the age of 13 onwards, and fulfilled the role of being a matriarch figure for him in his life, I was certain she might find me to be an interference in their lives that she could well do without. She might be particularly possessive of her grandson, as they had lived together alone for so many years, without any interference from outside parties. I was a little annoyed that Dustin had not told her all about me a long time ago, as it could have eased the pathway a little to make her accept the idea of me. I was the first girl he was bringing home to meet her, and that was not a good feeling for me. What if she didn't like me? What if Dustin cared so much about his grandmother's opinion of me that if she told him that she didn't like me at all, he might brush me away like the dog hairs on a coat? I had invested a lot in this relationship with Dustin. I had never felt this way about a boy before. I may have been young and naive, but I still knew a good thing when I saw it, and Dustin was the best thing that had ever happened to me. I was rather nervous when Dustin parked his car outside the cabin. "This is it," he said. "This is Old Glen, the cabin I've been telling you all about." He looked at me kindly and squeezed my hand affectionately. "Please don't panic, Clara. Look at you. You're as white as a sheet. It's going to be all right. You're being nervous about nothing. My grandmother's not going to bite you. I told you she's looking forward to meeting you." "Why is it, Dustin, that I doubt that very much?" I gritted my teeth and took in a deep breath. I reluctantly climbed out of the vehicle, wishing with all my heart and soul that the ground would swallow me up whole. I really did not want to meet Dustin's grandmother, who had such a hold over his life. I could even feel eyes on me as I got out of the car, and it was a disquieting feeling. I absolutely knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Nora Trevelli was clandestinely watching me from one of the cabin windows. She was giving me the eyeful and wondering if I could ever be good enough for her grandson. Somehow I doubted that very much. The door was flung open at once, before we'd even made our way to the cabin, and Nora stood there with a warm smile on her face. But when she looked at me, her smile dissipated, and her eyes appeared cold and dark. "Oh, this must be, oh, what is the name again? Oh, yes, Clara," she said, putting out her hand to shake mine. Her grip on me was so hard, the squeeze so uncomfortable, I almost winced out in agonizing pain as I quickly retracted my hand. I could swear I picked up a satisfied smirk on Nora's face, as if she had delighted in hurting me. But I promptly told myself I was being absolutely ridiculous. The woman just had a hard handshake because she was very strong. Lots of people had hard handshakes, did they not? "It's so lovely to meet you, Clara," said Mrs. Trevelli. She eyed me up once again with her curious eyes. "Dustin's a very dark horse, isn't he? He's kept you a secret for long enough." Dustin chuckled. Don't be like that, Granny. I didn't want to tell you anything about Clara until I knew exactly how I felt about her. Well, you must be a very special person, dear, said Nora, because you're the first girl that my grandson has actually brought home with him. Would you like to come into the dining room? Lunch is already laid out. I watched Nora Trevelli as she eagerly bustled around the lunch table, dishing up bowls of pasta and salad. You're a very good cook, Mrs. Trevelli, I said, complimenting her. This pasta tastes authentic. I mean, like real Italian. That is because my cuisine is authentic Italian, dear. You see, when I was a teenager, I fell pregnant. My parents were desperately ashamed. Having a baby out of wedlock at such a young age back in the day was quite scandalous, you know. I was quickly sent to Italy to stay with my father's brother during the duration of my pregnancy. That was where I learned to cook Italian. Wow, that's some story, Mrs. Trevelli. It certainly explains why you're an excellent cook. Well, I considered that year, as it happens, the year that I was pregnant with my daughter Kendall, to be a very fruitful year. I learnt a great deal, you know. I learnt to speak fluent Italian and to cook like an Italian. But in those days it was such a shame being pregnant. So my mother ended up raising my daughter Kendall as her very own. And then my daughter fell pregnant as a teenager as well. She followed in my footsteps, would you believe it? That's why I've raised Dustin here. So you can appreciate, I care very passionately about his happiness. Of course you do, Mrs. Trevelli. I can understand that. Please call me Nora, dear. Why did I get this ominous, funny feeling? That in Nora's words, she was subtly warning me that she was passionate about her grandson, and that if I hurt him in any way, I would be answerable to her, and there was no telling what she was capable of doing. Was I reading too much into this, I wondered? She was indeed an attractive woman for her age, but there was a hardness to her that I didn't like one little bit. I did feel, even when she wasn't looking at me, that she was studying me through eyes in the back of her head, and they were very judgmental ones. I got a profound sense that no one would ever measure up for Dustin. It was not what she said to me that made me believe this. It was what she didn't say. The truth was that even though the light-hearted banter between us was friendly, Nora was a great attentive host, ensuring my plate was kept full with pasta and my wine-glass topped up with red wine. But there were unspoken words that drilled into me, that although were not audible, I could hear clearly in my mind's eye. Get away from my grandson, if you know what's good for you, I heard in the silence. Once again I shrugged my shoulders. There was no way I'd heard that. Nora Trevelli was being a great host. She asked me all about myself and my family. She wanted to know how me and Dustin had actually met. She did frown when Dustin revealed he'd caught sight of me in church, and when he heard that my father was looking for someone to help him with his horses, that he'd seen this as the perfect opportunity to get to know me better. That seemed to go down with Nora like a lead balloon. She raised her brow and put on what I can only describe as an insincere smile. She looked at me through her soulless dark eyes and said, Goodness gracious me, my grandson really is a dark horse, isn't he? I don't know how many times she actually said that. Dustin chuckled. Well, I saw Clara in church, Granny, and I couldn't resist. I knew I had to find an industrious way to meet her, and meet her I did. Good for you, son. So you cooked up a clever plan, did you? I'm very happy for the both of you coming together like this. If you make my grandson happy, Clara, how can I complain about that? Well, Dustin is great, and it's all thanks to you, Mrs. Trevelli, I'm most sure. After all, you raised him. We connected from the very beginning. It was like we'd known each other forever. Well, I'm very glad to hear that, said Nora. But her voice lacked that full-bodied enthusiasm. I was sure she was not very happy with me being in Dustin's life. It was a feeling that plagued me. When Dustin dropped me back to my parents' farm, I told him about my misgivings, which he waved off as me being paranoid. You're being far too sensitive over this, Clara. I'm quite sure my grandmother loved you very much. If she asked you a lot of awkward questions, it was only because she was looking out for me. Isn't she allowed to be a little protective over her grandson? It might take her a while to warm up to you, but I'm quite sure she will come around. Granny Nora is a good woman. Yes, she's emotionally contained. Yes, she's reserved. But when she gets to know you, I'm sure she will love you, and you will love her in return. I don't think so, Dustin. There's something about your grandmother I don't like. When I told my mother about the lunch I'd had at Nora Trevelyan's cabin, and how I felt that Nora disliked me, my mother assured me that, like Dustin, I had got that all wrong. I think you're wrong about that, love. Don't forget I've met Nora Trevelyan at church myself. She's a lovely lady, you know. You must remember, love, she raised Dustin as her very own child for all these years. Then there you come along, like an unsuspected surprise that she never saw coming. It's bound to take her time to adjust. She's probably worried that you might hurt her grandson in some way. So she's naturally very protective of Dustin, and can you blame her for that? You yourself said that she's very cynical of romantic relationships, and that's understandable, because she's never been married, has she? I've got a great idea. Why don't you pop over and see her yourself? Bake some of your lemon drizzle cake for her. Tell her how much you like her grandson, and how you have no intention of hurting him. That might put her mind at ease. I rather think it will, you know. She's a very reasonable woman. You think it will work? I asked. Well, you won't know, will you, unless you try, love. But maybe the poor woman needs some reassurance. And you can give it to her, can't you? My mother's idea made an awful lot of sense to me. It took me 45 minutes on my bike to get to Mrs. Trevelyan's cabin. But I knew that Dustin was helping my dad with his horses, so that I would get Nora on her own. I hasten to say she was rather bewildered and taken aback to see me standing there on her doorstep, but she seemed genuinely pleased with the lemon drizzle cake I gave to her. Goodness gracious me, dear! How did you know I love lemons? We Italians, we appreciate lemons. It's the most tangy kind of dessert for us. We have lemon in almost everything in Italy. What a thoughtful thing for you to do. I don't know what to say, but please do come in. Mrs. Trevelyan, it's Nora, dear, she reminded me. Of course, so sorry, Nora. I came here today, to talk about Dustin with you. I knew he would be at my dad's farm, with your 2 Labradors at his side. I thought this would be the quintessential opportunity for us to have a talk together. Do you like walking while you talk, my dear? Mrs. Trevelyan asked me. I think a lovely walk in the woods might be well in order, don't you? There's a lovely trail I regularly take with the horses. It's open to the public, you see. We can ride there on Dustin's ATV, park it under the tree and take a walk through the woods. I was going to take a walk there myself, so it would be great if you came along with me. I usually go there on horseback, but the ATV will do just fine, and it's got 2 seats, you'll be pleased to know. I can pack up a bag for us with some homemade lemonade and some of your drizzle cake, and we can sit under the trees together to enjoy it. How do you fancy that? It's so much better eating out of doors, and we can lay down a rug under a tree and have a good old chinwag together. And it's such a beautiful day, is it not? It seems a pity to have our tea indoors. What do you say? It sounds absolutely lovely, Nora. I thought the idea of walking and talking was great, because I felt so ill at ease in Nora Trevelyan's presence. So while we walked and talked, it would allay my anxiety and help me tell Nora what was on my mind. I needed her to know that I was not going to get my hands on her grandson like a praying mantis and spit him out. I intended to be in this relationship for keeps if I had my way in the matter. Nora Trevelyan packed a bag with some goodies, while I went off to the bathroom to wash my hands. When I came back from the powder room, Nora and I climbed onto the ATV. which she parked outside the woods when we reached the public riding trail. We climbed off the ATV and began to casually stroll through the woods. And she was not wrong. It really was a prepossessing day. The sky was a cup of blue. The sunshine was gentle, offering a warm heat, while it spilled through the canopy of the trees and covered everything in a soft gossamer light. The earthen floor was richly fertile. Nora Trevelli packed a hearty bag with some goodies for us to enjoy while we were in the woods. I quickly went off to wash my hands in the powder room. When I returned, Nora guided me to the ATV, which she drove to the public hiking trail at a reasonable speed. It was a fun ride for the both of us, with the wind blowing in our hair. She parked outside the woods, and we casually meandered down the trail together, talking and laughing while we did. She was not wrong. It was a prepossessing day. The sky was a cup of blue. The sunshine was gentle, offering a warm heat, while it spilled generously through the canopy of the trees, covering everything in soft whispers of light. The earthen floor was richly fertile. Nora Trevelli was carrying a long bag over her shoulders, and she continued to talk to me. I was so glad I'd come to see her today. I was already seeing that all the awkwardness between us appeared to have dissolved. I must admit, Clara, you gave me quite the surprise dropping in on me like this, but a very pleasant surprise, I might add. You said it was my grandson you wanted to talk about. Is that right? Well, I understand, Mrs. Trevelli. Sorry, Nora, from what you were telling me, that you and Dustin have become very close over the years, and I want you to really know that I do understand that. We are incredibly close, agreed Nora. I raised him from the day he was born, you know. Even his own mother, Kendall, sees him as a brother. I genuinely think she's forgotten that she ever gave birth to him, you know. And Dustin views me as a mother and a grandmother. It's been him and me against the world for all this time. I can imagine. I know that you have a very special relationship with Dustin, and that he thinks the world of you. Oh dear, look, the footpath is getting rather narrow, isn't it? Said Nora. I tell you what, my dear, you go ahead of me. I'll walk behind you. What was it you were saying again? I didn't actually hear. I just want you to know, Nora, I said as I ascended the steep incline, well, that my intentions towards your grandson are honourable. I really like Dustin, Mrs. Trevelli. Oh, I'm sorry, Nora. And I can promise you that I will never hurt him. Never. So you came here today to tell me that, is that right? Well, yes. I wanted you to know that I really like Dustin, I said, the colour rising in my cheeks. I would never mess with him. I can understand you're very protective, but I want you to know that. You understand absolutely nothing, dear, I heard Nora saying behind me. And then suddenly I felt something violently hitting the back of my head. The force was so hard, I nearly fell right backwards. I turned around to see Nora with a hammer in her hand. Her eyes were blazing. They were manic. She was glaring at me defiantly. You will go nowhere near my grandson, she said with a growl. I will make sure of that, Clara. You, my dear, are not going to get your filthy paws on him. You're nothing but a little harlot throwing yourself at my Dustin. I'll never let anyone come between the two of us. I've killed before, you know, and I will do it again to ensure the boundaries are never crossed. I cannot see what on earth he saw in a runt like you. Nora Trevelli lunged forwards, with the hammer towards me again. I hurriedly backed out of the way. My head was booming violently from the first thump, from which blood was spilling down my face. I could taste the metallic taste in my mouth. Nora was grinning at me gormlessly, like some weird character you would see on a horror movie. She stared belligerently at the startled reaction on my face. I had not seen this coming. This woman was crazy. I needed to get away from her as fast as I could. But for some reason I just seemed incapable of moving away from her. I was so caught up in the shock of the moment that my body failed to catch up and to even respond, almost as if I was emotionally lagging behind. I was surprised I was still standing upright on my 2 feet, but everything was becoming rather wobbly and blurry. My mind was screaming to me, telling me to run away from this woman as fast as I could. Nora Trevelyan was a dangerous woman. She was intent on killing me. She had said as much, and I 100% believed her. My presence in her grandson's life had rattled her. She wanted me gone for good, and would go to any lengths and measures to ensure she disposed of me. I tried to run away, but I staggered around like an inebriated drunk. The blow to my head meant that everything around me was spinning. I tried to scream, call out for help, but nothing came out of my mouth. It was like I went completely mute. There was a murderous, vengeful look in Nora Trevelyan's eyes, as she came lunging towards me yet again, with a hammer raised in her hands. I closed my eyes, bracing for another beating on the head, when something very obscure came flying through the trees. It happened so very fast, I had no idea what was transpiring. I saw an obscure, dark, shadowy creature of approximately 8 foot tall, covered in hair. That was all I saw, a great big blob of black. But whatever it was, the creature appeared to pick up Nora in her overlong arms. Then she threw her up in the air as if she was all but a tennis ball. It was a Bigfoot that had come to my rescue. She was female. Nora came crashing to the ground and began to groan when she landed at the Bigfoot's feet. The Bigfoot walked over to her and then snapped her neck. That also happened so quickly. It was just so surreal. I stared confounded at the scene before me. I looked up at the female Bigfoot and heard a voice in my head. "Sorry you had to witness that. I do apologize, but I'm afraid she needed to go. She meant to harm you, and I couldn't allow that to happen. It's not your time to go yet, but it is hers." Everything suddenly went very black. I believe I must have passed out. I woke up later to find myself on Nora Trevelyan's wraparound porch, lying across the sun lounger. I suspect the Bigfoot had brought me here. Dustin was shaking me and asking me what the hell I was doing at their cabin, and he wanted to know where his grandmother was. At first I was disorientated and confused, but finally I managed to come around from my delirium and get my bearings. Then I remembered everything that had happened, and how Nora Trevelyan had tried to kill me with a hammer. When I told Dustin the story about what had happened, he was naturally devastated to hear that his grandmother had tried to harm me. "I don't understand why she would do such a wicked thing. I had no idea she had a dark side to her character like this. What were you doing here at the cabin?" he asked. "Well, I could tell your grandmother was very protective over you. I made her some lemon drizzle cake, popped over to tell her I had no intentions of hurting you. She suggested we went for a walk in the woods together, and then, when she was walking behind me, she lunged behind my back and attacked me with a hammer." "I can't believe she did this," said Dustin, looking completely shell-shocked. "Why on earth would she hurt you? I thought I knew my grandmother well, but I obviously don't know her at all. I can't believe she's capable of such evil." "Wake up, Dustin. Smell the coffee. Your grandmother does not want anyone coming between you and her. She wants you all to herself, don't you see? And I impose a threat to her. She told me as much." "Bloody hell! I don't know what to say, Clara. I am so sorry that you had to go through all this. I had no idea my grandmother was capable of such evil. She is a monster. There is no other word to describe her. I knew she was protective over me, of course I did. I saw it as a compliment. But this idiosyncratic behaviour borders on the obsessive, and it's not remotely healthy." I thought that Dustin was going to think the Bigfoot part of my story was a mere fabrication, but he listened to me intently and believed my every word. He was mortified to learn the woman that he really loved so much would be capable of such outrageous behaviour. It was like his eyes had finally opened, and he suddenly realised the tight grip his grandmother had had over his life, and how she had not wanted anything to come between them, and would have happily disposed of me and anything else that would have got in her way. She didn't want anything coming between them, least of all me. I suspect she'd have happily disposed of me and buried me in the woods so that no one would know what had happened to me. I would just become another missing person statistic. Dustin insisted on getting me checked out by the doctor, who said I'd taken a rather bad banging to my head, but that I would be fine. It was when we both met up with my grandmother's best friend Kiki at Nora Trevelyan's funeral that she told us about the dark side of her best friend. Now don't get me wrong, Dustin. I loved your grandmother Nora very much. Don't forget we grew up together, she told Dustin in earnest. But there was an insidious side to her character. I always knew deep in my gut that your grandmother had a very dangerous hold over your life, Dustin, and that one day she might do something quite dreadful, and it seems my fears were not unfounded. I was to learn later that the police believed that Nora Trevelyan had accidentally snapped her neck and fallen after chasing me around the woodgrove with a hammer. They also believed she'd killed Michael Drewbury, as she didn't want his interference in her life. It would seem the hammer she used on me matched the indentations of the hammer that she had used on Michael Drewbury's head. Our fears were later confirmed 5 years later, after I married Dustin and moved into the cabin. It was one day when I was cleaning out Nora Trevelyan's bedroom. I discovered, to my horror and disgust, a bottle containing 2 pickled eyeballs that were definitely human. I knew at once Nora Trevelyan had gouged out the eyes of Michael Drewbury with a surgical precision. She was clearly keeping the eyeballs as some kind of trophy. It was a horrifying thought to appreciate that had Nora Trevelyan managed to kill me, that my eyeballs might have also been gouged out and preserved in a pickle jar, as many narcissistic killers like to preserve such macabre mementos. I think the person that suffered the most from this ordeal was my husband Dustin, as despite everything he still adored his grandmother Nora, but seeing what she really was like underneath the layers of her saccharine sweetness had certainly thrown him a loop. Luckily, with plenty of counselling, he began to learn that none of this was his fault, and that his grandmother had an unfortunate illness that made her obsess over everything, like she had obsessed over her doll when she was 7 years old. So it would seem that against all the odds, a leopard never does change its spots. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.